who were the UFC's first true GOATs. These pioneers fought when MMA was raw and undefined, laying the foundation for today's sport. Their names might not appear as often as modern stars, but their impact, absolutely massive. So, let's dive into the stories of 7 fighters who deserve way more credit than they get. Royce Gracie. Starting with the man who changed the game. Royce Gracie, the first ever UFC tournament champion. If you're an MMA fan, you know Royce isn't just a fighter, he's a pioneer. Back in UFC 1, Royce was the underdog, smaller than most of his opponents, but armed with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, a style nobody outside Brazil understood yet. What happened? Royce dominated. He fought multiple opponents in one night, using technique and leverage to submit guys who were bigger, stronger, and more physically imposing. His success wasn't just about winning fights, it was a revelation. Royce proved that a smaller, skilled fighter could beat anyone with the right technique. That moment changed combat sports forever. Yet somehow, when people talk about the GOATs today, Royce's name doesn't always get the respect it deserves. Mark Coleman. Next up, Mark Coleman, the Hammer. Coleman was the first official UFC heavyweight champion, crowned in 1997 at UFC 12. What made Coleman special was his wrestling dominance and his brutal ground and pound style. Before Coleman, MMA was about style versus style, karate versus jiu-jitsu, wrestling versus kickboxing. But Coleman brought a new approach. Take your opponent down, control them, and rain down strikes until the fight is over. It was simple, but devastatingly effective. Coleman's style became the blueprint for many fighters who followed. He showed the world that wrestling combined with ground striking was a winning formula. Even with this, his name often gets lost when people discuss the greatest heavyweights, or GOATs, Maurice Smith. Now, let's talk about Maurice Smith. This guy was a former kickboxing champion who shocked the MMA world by beating Mark Coleman to become UFC heavyweight champion in 1997. Maurice brought striking legitimacy to a division that had been dominated by wrestlers. His ability to keep fights standing and outstrike opponents proved that heavyweights could win with skillful stand-up fighting, not just wrestling and grappling. Maurice's victory was a turning point for MMA, signaling that the sport was evolving into a well-rounded competition. Yet, Maurice Smith's name rarely gets the spotlight it deserves. If you appreciate striking in MMA, you owe it to yourself to remember Maurice as one of the first to prove that striking works at the highest level. Randy Couture. Then there's Randy Couture, a name you've probably heard, but even he sometimes gets underrated when discussing UFC's earliest GOATs. Couture was an Olympic-level wrestler who won the UFC Heavyweight Championship multiple times and later became a 2-division champ. What set Couture apart wasn't just his wrestling skills, but his fight IQ and longevity. He was still winning titles well into his 40s, almost unheard of in MMA. His early reign helped legitimize MMA when the sport was still fighting for mainstream acceptance. Even with his incredible career, some fans overlook his early contributions, focusing more on his later fights or flashier fighters who came after. But Randy Couture's role as a foundational figure and one of the first real GOATs is undeniable. Carlos Newton. Carlos Newton is another fighter who deserves more love. He was the first Canadian UFC champion, winning the welterweight title in 2001. Newton was known for his slick Brazilian jiu-jitsu and technical grappling. His most famous moment? Submitting Pat Miletic with a bulldog choke, a rare and highly technical move that remains iconic in UFC history. Newton was a pioneer in the welterweight division, blending striking and grappling in a way that few could match. Unfortunately, his title reign was short, and his name often gets buried behind bigger stars like Georges St-Pierre. But if you're a fan of technical mastery, Carlos Newton is one of the first true masters of the craft in the UFC. Dave Menne. Dave Menne was the UFC's first middleweight champion, winning the title in 2001. Menne was a gritty, tough fighter who helped establish the middleweight division before it exploded with stars like Anderson Silva and Chris Weidman. Even with being the first to hold that belt, Menne's name rarely comes up in GOAT conversations. The middleweight division today is stacked with talent, but it's important to remember that Dave Menne was the guy who started it all. His contributions to the division's early legitimacy are huge, even if they're often overlooked. Menne fought in an era where sport was still evolving, and his toughness and skill helped set the stage for the division's future greatness. Frank Shamrock. At last, Frank Shamrock was the first UFC light heavyweight champion and one of the most technically skilled fighters of his era. Frank was a complete mixed martial artist before the term was even popular. He combined striking, wrestling, and submissions into a seamless fighting style that set the standard for future light heavyweights. His dominance in the late 90s helped elevate MMA's credibility and showed the world that fighters needed to be well-rounded to succeed. Frank Shamrock's name doesn't come up as often as it should in modern GOAT debates, but make no mistake, his influence on sports evolution and his role as one of the first real GOATs is massive. Why were these champions forgotten? So why have these legends been forgotten or overshadowed? Well, the early UFC days didn't have the media coverage or social media hype we see now. Many of their fights weren't televised live, and the sport was still struggling for legitimacy. Some of these fighters had shorter title reigns or lost belts quickly, making it harder for fans to remember them. And of course, the rise of newer stars with longer reigns and more media attention naturally pushed these pioneers out of the spotlight. The UFC's promotional focus tends to highlight current champions and marketable stars, sometimes at the expense of honouring the trailblazers. Why we need to remember them. But these fighters were the first real GOATs. They fought without the luxury of modern training camps, sports science, or massive paychecks. They were the risk takers, the trailblazers who paved the way for MMA to become the global phenomenon it is today. Remembering them isn't just about nostalgia, it's about respecting the roots of sport and understanding how it evolved. Without Royce Gracie, Mark Coleman, Maurice Smith, Randy Couture, Carlos Newton, Dave Menner, and Frank Shamrock, the UFC wouldn't be where it is now. So next time you hear someone debate the UFC GOAT, don't just think about the big names of today. Remember the fighters who earned the title of the first real GOATs and deserve their place in MMA history. Want to know more about MMA's pioneers? Like, comment, and subscribe for deeper stories on the legends who shaped the sport.